0 o'clock to 1:30. Cold open narrator, East Germany, 1970s. A schoolteacher named Dieter wakes up one morning and notices something strange. The books on his shelf have been reorganized, not ransacked, reorganized, neatly, deliberately. He tells his wife. She thinks he is imagining things. A week later, anonymous letters begin arriving at his workplace accusing him of affairs he never had. His colleagues begin to distance themselves. His supervisor starts questioning his loyalty. Dieter has no idea what is happening to him. He begins to doubt his own memory. He starts to wonder if he is going insane. He is not insane. He is a target. Narrator: what Dieter was experiencing had a name. The East German secret police, the Stasi, called it Zersetzung, a German word that translates roughly to decomposition or corrosion. And it was exactly that. A slow, invisible rot carefully engineered to destroy a human being from the inside out without leaving a single bruise, without filing a single criminal charge, without ever letting the victim know who was doing it or why. Today, we are going inside one of the most psychologically sophisticated state terror programs in human history. 1:30 to 3:30, the machine behind the madness. Narrator: to understand Zersetzung, you first have to understand the Stasi. The Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security, was founded in 1950, just 1 year after the German Democratic Republic was established as a Soviet satellite state. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the Stasi had become the most pervasive surveillance apparatus any government had ever constructed. Narrator: at its peak, the Stasi employed roughly 91,000 full-time officers, but the real reach came from its network of informal informants, citizens who reported on their neighbors, colleagues, friends, and even family members. Estimates suggest there was one Stasi informant for every 63 citizens in East Germany. For context, the Soviet KGB had roughly one agent per 595 citizens. The Nazi Gestapo had one per 2,000. The Stasi made them all look amateur. Narrator: for its first 2 decades, the Stasi operated the way most secret police forces do, through arrests, interrogations, imprisonment, and overt intimidation. But by the early 1970s, under the leadership of Erich Mielke, the ministry recognized a problem. Overt repression was generating international attention, diplomatic pressure, and perhaps more dangerously, martyrs. Jailed dissidents became symbols. Symbols galvanized movements. The Stasi needed a new approach, something quieter, something that left no fingerprints. Narrator: the solution they developed was codified in a 1976 internal directive. The document laid out a comprehensive methodology for neutralizing enemies of the state not through imprisonment, but through the systematic destruction of their psychological stability, their personal relationships, their professional reputations, and their grip on reality itself. 3:30 to 5:30. The Tactics, an anatomy of psychological warfare. Narrator: Zersetzung was not improvised cruelty. It was a bureaucratic science. Officers were trained in psychology and given detailed operational manuals. Each target received a tailored destruction plan, built around an intimate surveillance profile that could take months or years to construct before a single operation began. Narrator: the first phase was intelligence gathering. Stasi agents would enter a target's home while they were away, a practice they called a conspiratorial search. They would photograph every room, catalog every item, read every diary, copy every letter. This was not to find evidence of a crime. It was to build a map of the person's inner world, their fears, their relationships, their ambitions, their secrets, so that map could later be used against them. Narrator: then the operations would begin, and they were diabolically creative. Agents would move objects inside a target's home, just slightly, just enough to be noticed but not enough to be explained. They would send forged letters to a target's employer suggesting misconduct. They would whisper rumors to a target's friends and family, carefully crafted rumors based on real insecurities the surveillance had uncovered. They would make anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, then hang up. They would arrange for a target's car to repeatedly fail inspection, for their job applications to be mysteriously rejected, for their children to be passed over for university admission. Narrator: in some cases, They would introduce a romantic partner who was actually a Stasi agent, someone tasked with gaining complete emotional access to a target before systematically betraying them. These operatives were called Romeo agents, and the emotional devastation they left behind was considered a feature, not a flaw. Narrator: the goal of every tactic was the same: to make the target feel that their world was collapsing around them, for reasons they could never quite identify or prove, to make them appear paranoid and unstable when they tried to explain what was happening, to isolate them, discredit them, and ultimately neutralize them, without the Stasi ever having to show its face. 5:30 to 7:30. The human cost. Narrator: the Stasi estimated that Zersetzung campaigns lasted an average of between 1 and 3 years for a typical target. For higher priority cases, operations could continue for decades. The psychological literature on what this kind of chronic, invisible persecution does to a human being is brutal reading. Narrator: targets consistently developed what psychiatrists today recognize as symptoms nearly identical to complex post-traumatic stress disorder: chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, an inability to trust anyone, depression, paranoia, the genuine kind, the kind born from the very real experience of being watched and manipulated. Many targets experienced complete psychological breakdowns. Some were committed to psychiatric institutions, a fate the Stasi often deliberately engineered, since a person labeled mentally ill loses their credibility entirely. Narrator: others simply destroyed themselves. The rates of suicide among identified Zersetzung targets are difficult to fully document because the program itself was designed to leave no trace. But researchers who have worked through the Stasi archives have found case after case where the file notes, with chilling bureaucratic detachment, that a subject has been, quote, finally neutralized. Narrator: one of the most documented cases involves the writer and civil rights activist Jürgen Fuchs. Fuchs was a persistent thorn in the side of the East German state, articulate, credible, and connected to international networks that made simple imprisonment politically costly. The Stasi ran a Zersetzung operation against him for years. His home was entered repeatedly. His relationships were systematically poisoned. His health deteriorated. Fuchs wrote about his experiences in detail and spent the rest of his life documenting what had been done to him and others. He died of leukemia in 1999. Some researchers have since raised questions about whether his illness may have had roots in deliberate exposure to radiation, a tactic the Stasi is now known to have experimented with in some cases. 7:30 to 9:30. The archives and the reckoning. Narrator: when the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, and the East German state began to collapse, Stasi officers worked frantically to destroy their records. They shredded documents by the ton. In some offices, the shredding machines broke down from overuse, and officers resorted to tearing documents apart by hand. Millions of pieces of paper were stuffed into sacks and left in warehouses, where East German citizens found them days later. Narrator: what they could not destroy tells a staggering story. The surviving Stasi archive contains approximately 111 kilometers of files. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal, physical length of the shelving required to store the documents that survived. It includes files on an estimated 6 million East German citizens, in a country whose total population was roughly 17 million people. Narrator: Germany established the Stasi Records Authority, known commonly as the BStU, to manage these archives and allow citizens to access their own files. Hundreds of thousands of people applied. Many of them read their files and discovered for the first time that the paranoia they had lived with for years was entirely justified, that the friend who had seemed to pull away was an informant, that the job opportunity that had vanished had been deliberately killed, that the slow unraveling of their lives had been planned in detail by officers who never once met them face to face. Narrator: for some survivors, reading the file brought a terrible kind of relief. The nightmare had been real. They had not been imagining it. For others, the files revealed betrayals by spouses, siblings, lifelong friends that proved more devastating than anything the Stasi had done directly. 9:30 to 11 o'clock. Why this still matters. Narrator: it would be comforting to believe that Zersetzung was a relic, a horror specific to a particular time, a particular ideology, a particular regime that no longer exists. That comfort is not entirely available to us. Narrator: the techniques the Stasi developed and refined did not disappear when the wall came down. They were studied. The concept of using social isolation, reputation destruction, financial pressure, and manufactured self-doubt as tools of social control is not confined to history. Researchers who study modern authoritarian surveillance states, online harassment,